Will you pray with me? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Wandering, wondering. Seems if we walk with God long enough, somewhere along the way, we will find ourselves doing just that. Wandering, wondering. That's what Abram and Sarai have been up to when we encounter them in Genesis 15. God tells them, go from your country, go from your family, go from your people to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. From the land of Ur to the land of Canaan, they go holding fast to God's promises of progeny and land. This isn't the first time in Genesis that God speaks to Abram, but it is the first time that Abram responds to God. The back and forth exchange takes place. I mean, the man has questions, and who can blame him? Their conversation begins with Yahweh saying, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. And then Abram's questions begin. What did you promise me again, God? How can your promises be true? How on earth could your promise of heirs be true if I don't have any biological descendants? And we are so old. And then he asks, and how am I to know? Because the facts on the ground of Abram's life do not at all seem to match up with the promises that God has made him. How am I to understand your promise, God? How are my wife and I to interpret that promise in light of the hard realities of our lives? Abram and Sarai wander outside and they look up toward heaven. And they count the stars. And they wonder how they can make sense of the divine revelation given to them. Life with God eventually leads us to wandering and wondering. Seems to me that wandering and wondering will always lead us to questions. Questions, especially the hard questions that are a part of our lives of faith. And faith does not preclude us from asking God hard questions. In fact, faith invites and beckons and compels us to questions and to give full voice to those questions that we see happening in the scriptures today. Abram's questions are reasonable. How does God's promise to him make sense in the face of the barrenness that he and Sarai were experiencing? And in response to Abram's questioning, God makes a covenant with him. It is a distinct form of mutual agreement. Biblical covenants of which God is a party start off with less mutuality. In biblical covenants, God is the initiator and God sets the terms. God makes the promises. God decides how the covenant will be sealed, and God acts out the covenant agreement. In the ancient Middle East, long before the writing of contracts, they had a custom where covenants were sealed by cutting animals in half and placing the two halves apart from each other and making a path between them. I know it sounds more than a little strange to our 21st century ears, but the two parties would then begin walking from opposite ends of the path between the animal pieces, passing each other in the middle and ending up where the other person began. When they walked between the pieces, they declared they would be cut in half like the animals if they failed to keep their end of the covenant. As wild and bloody as that sounds to us, here's what you need to know about how God makes this covenant with Abram. In the 15th chapter of Genesis, God directs Abram to bring the animals and to cut them in half to make the path. But God and God alone is the one who passes between the pieces. And God does so in the form of fire. Abram is the passive observer here. But from that point on, Abram is asked to continue to be in relationship with God, bringing along all of his questions, all of his doubts, and all of his hopes in the midst of all he is experiencing. In so many ways, Abram's and Sarah's story is our story, a story of a God who reaches out to us, a God who initiates relationship, a God who always makes the first move, and a story of a people who respond, or at least attempt to respond faithfully. They are two people wondering how to deal with a promise in the face of uncertainty, and how to live as creatures of hope in the face of hopelessness. How are we to know? Doesn't that sound like something many of us have sometime experienced? Maybe we've experienced this especially in the last 2 years, living with the uncertainty and the challenge of a pandemic. Abram asks, how are we to know? And Mary, the mother of Jesus, asks, how can this be? These are some of the great biblical questions that I believe get at the heart of what faith is about. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann defines faith as certitude that is based not on reason, but on a primal awareness that God is God. God is a God who is the first to shed a tear when heartache and loss shatter our world. God is a God who refuses to let the worst thing remain the last thing. God is a God who is faithful to love us and to be with us and for us. God is a God who brings a break between the exhausted present and the buoyant future. God is a God who loves and claims each of us and will stop at absolutely nothing for us to know that and to believe that. So Abram's faith is formed in the crucible of life, where the changes and chances of this life can threaten to undo us. And following his questions, Abram doesn't have some kind of generalized laissez-faire sense of everything will just work out eventually. No, Abram asks the hard questions and comes to a new orientation and understanding of his world based on a concrete promise from a known promise maker. Abram and Sarai live in that space between what God has promised and their experiences on the ground. And in that space, they wander and wonder. And the rest of their narrative explores how faith permits them to trust and how God really can be trusted. I really love this story of these two saints because they're honest about what doesn't make sense to them. And honestly, I also love their story because I have trouble with the kind of religion that has pat answers when we ask hard questions. You know the kind of answer I mean. God has a plan. God doesn't give you more than you can handle. God is in control. Oh, everything happens for a reason. And so many other statements like that that you could probably add to. I've just never found sentiments like these to be very helpful or true to my own experience as a child of God. But in my own experience, I do know that God is faithful. I've come through some hard times in my own life. I've lost people I've loved. I've been unemployed more than once. I've raised children who did things to make your hair stand on end, including running away for 9 months. And God has asked me to do some hard things. But God has always been faithful. God has always seen me through. 73 years and I'm still standing here. God's been faithful. I think I told you maybe last week or the week before how God called me to go off into ministry, and I said yes. And after I said yes, because part of what I did respond to God was, well, God, you got to find the way. Because I didn't know how that would happen. Part of God being faithful is that I said yes. I applied to 3 seminaries, was admitted to all 3 of them, still didn't know how I was going to make this happen. And then all of a sudden, just a few weeks after all that happened, somebody calls me up and offers me a better job than I'd ever had in my whole life financially. So I called up Yale, where I had decided I wanted to go, and I said, well, could I postpone my admission for a year? They said yes. And for 18 months, I went off and did a job that financed my life so I could go to divinity school for 3 years. God made a way. God is faithful. One of the things I loved about being at Yale was hearing all those stories of all those other midlife people. Everybody I met who was in the middle of life, who was leaving a career, everybody had a story of God's faithfulness. It was so totally amazing. I loved sitting at the lunch table in the refectory and getting to know these other people because you'd hear their stories. I remember one story of one woman, and her husband had left her, and she had 2 young teenage boys trying to raise. The husband was a deadbeat. There was no more money. She had like nothing, absolutely nothing. And she was driving home wondering how she was going to find rent money for 1 more month. She pulled into her driveway, And suddenly this voice in her head told her to do a thing she had never, ever, ever done before. The voice said to back out of the driveway and go down to the corner store and buy a lottery ticket. And it was like, who, me, God? I've never bought a lottery ticket in my life. She talked back to God. But for some reason, she went and did it anyway. And of course, you know how that one turned out, right? She won enough money to get herself and her two sons through a really hard time. Somehow God provides. God provides. God is faithful no matter what happens in our lives. God is faithful. And even when the endings don't come out quite the way we wish they would come out. But then God is faithful to walk with us through a very hard time. When I was a pastor in Nebraska was when Hurricane Katrina happened. And shortly after that hurricane, along with some other churches in the area, we gathered together some volunteers and went down to Louisiana to see what we could do to help with cleanup and some rebuilding. And we went to a home, what was left of it, of a man named Victor. He had survived that hurricane, but he had lost some other family members in that hurricane. And there was so much damage to his house and his yard. But there was Victor out in the backyard. And Victor had found an old piece of board out there that had blown from someplace. And he had taken a can of spray paint and he had sprayed onto this board in giant letters, God is faithful. And he had posted it up there in the middle of the debris. You could see it from the highway. Because this man knew that while he was in the middle of this disaster, Victor knew that God was walking with him through the disaster. God promises to be faithful. God promised Abraham and Sarai that they would be the parents of a great nation with descendants more numerous than the stars. And God kept that promise. And God promises to each and every one of us to also be totally and utterly faithful. So no matter what the challenges are that come into your life, today, tomorrow, next week, God is faithful. God sees us through, always. I pray you know that and believe that deep in your souls. Amen.